They bound her wrists with raw hide, painted death marks across her face, and left her to die in the canyon of bones while the vultures circled overhead like black omens against the desert sky. The morning had started like any other in the Comanche. Camp along the Brazos River. Shala, barely 14 summers old, had been grinding cornmeal outside her grandmother's teepee when the commotion began. Raised voices carried across the camp circle, followed by the heavy footsteps of the tribal council approaching through the early morning mist. She looked up from her work to see Chief Running Bear leading a group of elders, their faces painted for judgment, their expressions carved from stone. Her grandmother, Ayana, emerged from the teepee with the slow dignity of someone who had lived through too many seasons of sorrow. The old woman's weathered hands found Ciala's shoulders, pulling her close as the council formed a semicircle around them. The smell of sage and wood smoke clung to her grandmother's buckskin dress, familiar scents that had meant safety and belonging. For as long as Ciala could remember, "The spirits have spoken," Chief Running Bear announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The drought continues because the gods are angry. The buffalo have not returned because we harbor one who carries bad medicine." His dark eyes fixed on Ciala with the coldness of winter wind. "The half-blood child brings curse upon our people." Ciala felt the ground shift beneath her feet like quicksand. Half-blood, the word that had followed her since birth, whispered behind hands when the adults thought she couldn't hear. Her father had been a white trapper who stayed just long enough to leave his mark in her unusual green eyes, and the auburn highlights that caught fire in her black hair when the sun hit it just right. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving only questions and resentment in her wake. "She is blood of my blood," Ayana said, stepping protectively in front of her granddaughter. "She has done nothing to anger the spirits. She works hard, honors the old ways, shows respect to her elders. What crime has she committed except being born?" The old woman's voice trembled not with fear, but with righteous fury. Medicine Wolf, the tribe's spiritual leader, stepped forward with his painted staff, adorned with feathers and bones. His face was a canvas of red and black paint that made him look more spirit than man. "The signs are clear, grandmother. The rain stopped the day after her moon ceremony. The hunting parties return empty-handed while she walks among us. The sickness took 3 children this winter, and still she lives." He pointed his staff at Ciala like a weapon. "The spirits demand balance." "The spirits demand sacrifice," Chief Running Bear corrected, his hand resting on the ornate tomahawk at his belt. "The Canyon of Bones hungers for appeasement. She will go there at dawn, alone, with nothing but water for one day. If she survives 3 suns and returns, the gods have deemed her innocent. If not, her death will lift the curse from our people, the Canyon of Bones." Even the name made seasoned warriors cross themselves and whisper protective prayers. It was a place where the earth split open like a wound, where the bones of ancient beasts and forgotten peoples lay bleached white under the merciless desert sun. Stories said it was cursed ground where spirits wandered hungry and angry, where men lost their minds to visions and thirst. In all the oral histories of the tribe, no one sent to the Canyon of Bones had ever returned. Ciala found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Grandmother, tell them about the vision you had when I was born. You said the spirits showed you I would bring honor to our people, that I would be a bridge between 2 worlds." Ayana's face crumpled with grief and helplessness. "I remember, little wolf. But they will not listen to an old woman's dreams. When fear has taken root in their hearts, fear makes men cruel and desperate." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation and farewell. Ciala was allowed to keep only her buckskin dress, her grandmother's silver bracelet, and a single water gourd that would sustain her for perhaps 2 days if she was careful. No weapons, no food, no tools for making fire or shelter. The elders made it clear that survival was not expected, merely the possibility of divine intervention. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky the color of dried blood, Ayana sat with her granddaughter beside the dying embers of their fire. The old woman had aged 10 years in a single day, the weight of helplessness bowing her shoulders and deepening the lines around her eyes. She pressed a small medicine pouch into Siala's hands, her fingers lingering over the soft leather. "This belonged to your mother," Ayana whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Inside is sage for protection, turquoise for strength, and a lock of your mother's hair. She was brave like you. She faced death to bring you into this world, and you carry her courage in your blood." Siala clutched the pouch to her chest, feeling the small weight of it like an anchor. "Will you remember me, grandmother? Will you tell the children stories about me when I'm gone? You are not going to die," Ayana said fiercely, gripping her granddaughter's shoulders. "You are strong, clever, resourceful. You know which plants hold water, which rocks provide shelter, which animals can be trusted. The desert is harsh, but not without mercy for those who know its secrets. Survive, little wolf. Live to prove them all wrong." Before dawn, while the camp still slept and the morning star hung low in the eastern sky, Siala was awakened by rough hands and harsh voices. Two warriors, Bearclaw and Stonehawk, bound her wrists with rawhide cords and painted the traditional death marks on her face with red ochre and charcoal. The marks would identify her to the spirits as one marked for sacrifice, ensuring that even if she somehow survived the canyon, she could never return to walk among the living. The ride to the Canyon of Bones took most of the morning crossing terrain that grew increasingly desolate as they traveled west. The grass gave way to scattered scrub brush, then to bare rock and sand. The temperature climbed steadily as the sun rose higher, and Siala could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the early hour. Her horse, a gentle mare she had helped train, seemed to sense the wrongness of their destination and grew increasingly skittish as they rode. When they finally crested the last ridge and the Canyon of Bones spread out below them, Siala understood why grown men spoke of it in hushed whispers. The earth simply ended, dropping away into a chasm. So deep and wide, it seemed to have been carved by the gods themselves in a moment of terrible wrath. The walls were striped with layers of red and brown stone, and scattered along the canyon floor were indeed the bleached white bones of creatures so large they defied imagination. Ancient ribs curved up from the sand like the frames of ships, and skulls the size of boulders grinned with teeth as long as a man's forearm. "The spirits of the ancient ones rest uneasy here," Bearclaw said, his usual bravado replaced by nervous reverence. "And they say the ground still trembles with their anger, and the wind carries the voices of all who have died in this place. You will add your voice to theirs, half-blood, and perhaps their hunger will be satisfied." Stonehawk dismounted and got the bonds from her wrists, then handed her the water gourd with something that might have been pity in his eyes. "3 sons," he reminded her. "If you live that long, you may attempt the climb out. But look around you, girl. See how the walls curve inward? See how the rock crumbles at a touch? No one has ever climbed out of the Canyon of Bones." They left her standing at the rim as the sun reached its peak, 2 figures growing smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely into the shimmering heat haze. Siala was alone with the vast silence of the desert, the weight of the water gourd in her hands, and the terrible choice between dying slowly of thirst and exposure, or dying quickly by attempting to descend the treacherous walls. She chose descent. Using roots and rock outcroppings as handholds, she began the careful climb down into the canyon. The stone was indeed treacherous, crumbling away under her feet and hands, sending cascades of loose rock tumbling into the depths below. More than once she slipped, saved only by grabbing desperately at whatever growth or ledge presented itself. By the time she reached the canyon floor, her hands were bloody and her legs shook with exhaustion. The floor of the Canyon of Bones was a landscape from nightmares. Ancient skeletons lay partially buried in sand that shifted constantly in the hot wind. Ribs and vertebrae created natural shelters, while massive skulls provided shade from the blazing sun. The silence was absolute, except for the whisper of wind through bone and the distant cry of vultures riding the thermals high above. Ciala found shelter in the shadow of what had once been a creature beyond her comprehension, its skull large, enough to house a family, and its teeth worn smooth by countless centuries of wind and sand. She rationed her first sips of water carefully, knowing that even with discipline, the gourd would be empty by tomorrow evening. After that, her survival would depend on finding water in a place that looked like it had never known a drop of rain. As the day wore on and the heat became unbearable, she explored her bone cathedral with growing desperation. Among the ancient remains, she found pottery shards and arrowheads that spoke of other peoples who had once called this place home before whatever catastrophe had turned it into a graveyard. She found the remains of more recent visitors too, human bones picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the sun. Night brought blessed coolness, but also new terrors. The darkness seemed alive with movement and sound. And more than once, Ciala thought she saw figures moving among the bones, only to discover they were shadows cast by moonlight. The wind moaned through the canyon like the voices of the dead, and she found herself clutching her mother's medicine pouch and whispering prayers to any spirits who might be listening. The second day dawned with the promise of even greater heat, and Ciala woke to find her water supply dangerously low. She had been careful, sipping only when absolutely necessary, but the desert air sucked moisture from the body like a living thing. Her lips were already beginning to crack, and she could feel the first signs of delirium creeping in around the edges of her consciousness. It was while searching desperately for any sign of water that she found the cave, hidden behind a curtain of hanging roots and partially concealed by fallen rocks. It was barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The opening was narrow, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but inside it opened up into a chamber large enough to stand in. And there, miracle of miracles, was water. Not much, just a small pool fed by some underground spring that seeped through the rock, but it was clean and cool and sweet. Ciala fell to her knees beside it and drank deeply, feeling life flow back into her parched body. She refilled her gourd and drank again, then sat back against the cave wall and felt hope stir in her chest for the first time since leaving the tribal camp. But hope was a dangerous thing in the Canyon of Bones. As she explored deeper into the cave, following the sound of dripping water, she discovered that she was not the first to find this sanctuary. Human bones lay scattered in the deeper chambers, along with the remnants of clothing and personal effects. Someone else had found water and shelter, but something had killed them nonetheless. The answer came with a sound that turned her blood to ice water. A low growl echoing from the depths of the cave, followed by the scrape of claws on stone. Something lived in the depths of this place, something that had claimed the cave as its own territory. Ciala backed toward the entrance, moving as quietly as possible, but the growling grew louder and closer. She burst from the cave opening just as something large and furious exploded out behind her. A mountain lion, massive and scarred, with eyes that gleamed yellow in the morning sun. It had been sleeping in the deeper chambers when her presence awakened it, and now it crouched between her and her only source of water, muscles bunched for a killing strike. Ciala ran through the maze of ancient bones, leaping over ribs and dodging around skulls, with the mountain lion in pursuit. Her bare feet found purchase on sand and stone, and her smaller size allowed her to dart through gaps too narrow for her pursuer. But she could hear it crashing through the obstacles behind her, growing closer with each passing second. She scrambled up the side of an enormous ribcage, using the curved bone like a ladder, just as the mountain lion leapt for where she had been. The great cat's claws scraped against the ancient bone, but found no purchase, and it fell back to the sand with a frustrated snarl. For a moment, they stared at each other across the gap, predator and prey locked in a deadly standoff. The lion circled the bone structure like a patient hunter, looking for a way up or waiting for her to come down. Ciala clung to her perch, knowing that she couldn't stay there forever. The sun was climbing higher, and without access to the water in the cave, she would be dead of thirst within hours. But descending meant facing the lion's claws and teeth. It was then, as she sat trapped between the burning sun and the patient predator below, that she heard the sound that would change everything, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Then another and another, followed by a man's voice shouting words she couldn't quite make out. The mountain lion's head snapped toward the sound, its ears flattening against its skull. It had clearly encountered men with guns before, and understood the threat they represented. With a final frustrated growl in Ciala's direction, it bounded away through the maze of bones, disappearing into shadows and distance. Ciala climbed higher on her bone tower, straining to see over the canyon floor toward the source of the gunshots. There, picking his way carefully through the treacherous landscape of ancient remains, was a man unlike any she had ever seen. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hair the color of prairie wheat, he moved with the careful confidence of someone who knew how to read dangerous ground. He carried a rifle in the crook of his arm and led a sturdy horse that picked its way delicately around the scattered bones. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment neither moved. Then the man raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a gesture of peace, and began making his way toward her position. As he drew closer, Ciala could see that his clothes marked him as a rancher or settler, practical clothing designed for hard work and harsh weather, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed out of place in the canyon of bones. "Easy there, miss," he called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "I'm Matthias Crosswind, but folks call me Matt. I heard the commotion and thought someone might be in trouble." "That's a fair-sized cat you were tangling with." Ciala found herself unable to speak, overwhelmed by the impossibility of rescue appearing just when death seemed certain. She climbed down from her perch on shaking legs, her body finally allowing her to feel the fear and exhaustion she had been fighting for 2 days. Matt approached slowly, his hands visible and his rifle pointed at the ground. "You're hurt," he observed, noting the scratches on her hands and arms, the death marks painted on her face, the exhaustion that made her sway on her feet. "And you look like you haven't had water in a while. Here." He offered her a canteen from his saddle, the metal warm from the sun, but the water inside still cool and clean. She drank gratefully, trying not to gulp, despite her desperate thirst. When she finally lowered the canteen, she found him studying her face with an expression of growing understanding and anger. "Those are death marks," he said quietly. "Your own people did this to you, left you here to die." It wasn't a question. Matt Crosswind had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the signs of tribal judgment when he saw them. His jaw tightened with suppressed fury at the cruelty of it. Ciala nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness in his eyes was almost harder to bear than the cruelty of her own people. She had prepared herself for death, but she had not prepared herself for rescue. "Well," Matt said, settling his hat more firmly on his head, "I reckon we better get you out of this bone yard before that cat comes back with friends. My ranch isn't far, and my housekeeper makes a fine stew that'll put some meat back on your bones. You can tell me your story when you're ready." As he helped her up onto his horse and began leading the way toward the canyon walls, Ciala felt the weight of the painted death marks on her face and wondered what kind of life awaited someone who was already marked for the grave. The climb out of the canyon of bones proved nearly as treacherous as the descent had been, but with Matt's steady guidance and his horse's sure footing, what had seemed impossible became merely difficult. He had found a route that zigzagged up the eastern wall, following ledges and natural handholds that spoke of years spent exploring these badlands. His horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Sage, seemed to know the path by heart, never hesitating, even when loose stone shifted under her hooves. Ciala rode behind Matt, her arms wrapped around his waist as they navigated the treacherous ascent. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, smell the scents that clung to his clothes, leather and sage, wood smoke and honest sweat. It was different from the familiar odors of the Comanche camp, alien yet somehow comforting. Here was a man who worked with his hands, who knew the value of patience and persistence. "Hold tight now," he called back, as Sage negotiated a particularly narrow ledge. "This next part gets a mite tricky. The rock's been undercut by water over the years, so it's not as solid as it looks." His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if rescuing painted death-marked girls from bone-filled canyons was something he did every Tuesday. When they finally reached the canyon rim, Ciala had to blink several times to convince herself that the world above still existed. After 2 days in that ancient graveyard, the sight of grass and scattered wildflowers seemed like something from a dream. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that made the landscape glow like something touched by magic. Matt dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady and respectful. "We've got maybe 3 hours of good light left," he said, checking the position of the sun with the practiced eye of someone who lived by its rhythms. "My place is about an hour's ride if we take it easy. You think you can manage that, or do you need to rest here a spell?" Ciala shook her head, though the effort of speaking still felt monumental. "I can ride," she managed, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. The death marks on her face felt like they were burning in the afternoon sun, a constant reminder of what she had left behind in that canyon. They rode north across terrain that gradually transformed from desert scrubland to rolling hills dotted with oak trees and crossed by clear-running streams. Matt set an easy pace, stopping frequently to let Sage drink and rest, always mindful of his passenger's condition. He didn't press for conversation, seeming to understand that she needed time to process what had happened to her. The Crosswind Ranch appeared like a mirage in the growing dusk, nestled in a valley between 2 gentle hills and surrounded by the largest spread of cultivated land Ciala had ever seen. Pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with cattle that looked sleek and healthy. Corrals held horses of every color, from midnight black to pale cream. Barns and outbuildings were scattered across the property with the organized efficiency of a well-run operation, but it was the main house that took her breath away. Built of local stone and timber, it sprawled across a slight rise like it had grown from the earth itself. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides, supported by columns made from whole tree trunks. Windows glowed with warm yellow light, and smoke curled up from 2 separate chimneys. It looked like the kind of place where families gathered for Sunday dinners, and children learned to ride before they could properly walk. "It's not much," Matt said with characteristic understatement, "but it keeps the rain off and the cold out. Been in my family for 20 years now. My pa built most of it with his own hands, and I've been adding to it ever since." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from honest work and tangible accomplishment. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron and squinting through the gathering darkness. She was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of sturdy build that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and a mouth that looked like it smiled more often than it frowned. "Matt Crosswind, where in tarnation have you been?" she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been worrying for hours. "I expected you back before supper, and here you come, riding in after dark, with—" She stopped mid-sentence as she got a good look at Ciala, her expression shifting from exasperation to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Found her in the Canyon of Bones, Rosa," Matt explained as he helped Ciala dismount. "Looks like her own people left her there to die. She's been without food for days and barely had enough water to keep breathing. Think you could rustle up some of that beef stew and maybe a hot bath?" Rosa Martinez had been Matt's housekeeper and cook for 15 years, ever since his mother died and left him to run the ranch alone. She had raised 5 children of her, owned and buried 2 of them, experiences that had given her an unerring instinct for when someone needed mothering. One look at Ciala's hollow cheeks and haunted eyes told her everything she needed to know. "Ay, Dios mío," she murmured, crossing herself. "Look at this poor niña, skinny as a rail and marked for death. Come here, mija, let Rosa take care of you. Matt, you get that horse settled and then stay out of the kitchen until I call you. This girl needs woman's care right now." Ciala found herself swept into the house on a tide of Rosa's determined kindness. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior, with rooms that flowed naturally from one to another and furniture that looked built to last for generations. But what struck her most was the sense of occupancy, of a place that was truly lived in and cared for. Books lay open on tables, blankets were draped casually over chairbacks, and the walls were covered with photographs and paintings that spoke of family history and personal taste. The kitchen was the heart of the house, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that radiated warmth and the promise of good food. Copper pots hung from hooks, and shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserves and spices that perfumed the air with the sense of civilization. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface scarred by years of meal. "Preparation and family gatherings. First things first," Rosa declared, filling a large pot with water and setting it on the stove to heat. "We get those death marks off your face, then we get some food in you, then we worry about everything else. You understand English, mija? Hablas español?" She switched effortlessly between languages, her tone warm and maternal regardless of which one she used. Ciala nodded to both questions. Like many Comanche children, she had learned multiple languages out of necessity, picking up Spanish from traders and English from the occasional settler who passed through their territory. The ability to communicate across cultures had always been a source of pride. Now it felt like another mark of her half-blood status that had ultimately doomed her. Rosa worked with the efficient care of someone who had tended to hurt and frightened people before. She gently cleaned the ochre and charcoal death marks from Ciala's face with warm water and soft cloths, muttering prayers and endearments in Spanish as she worked. The paint came away slowly, taking with it the last visible connection to the tribe that had rejected her. "There now," Rosa said with satisfaction, studying her work. "Much better. You have a beautiful face, mija, too beautiful to hide under paint meant for the dead. Now, let's see about getting you into some proper clothes while that bath water heats." The clothes Rosa provided were a revelation. A simple cotton dress in pale blue, clean and soft, and sized to actually fit rather than hang loose or pull tight. Undergarments that had been carefully mended and pressed, stockings without holes and shoes that didn't pinch or gape. For someone who had spent her life in buckskin and hand-me-downs, the sensation of wearing clothes made specifically for comfort was almost overwhelming. The bath that followed was pure luxury. Rosa had filled a large copper tub with hot water scented with lavender, and she provided soap that smelled like roses and towels that were thick and soft. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ciala sank into the warm water and felt 2 days of fear and exhaustion begin to melt away from her body. When she finally emerged, pink and clean and wrapped in Rosa's largest towel, she felt almost human again. Dinner was served in the kitchen at the big wooden table, and it was a meal unlike anything Ciala had ever experienced. Rosa's beef stew was rich and hearty, thick with vegetables, and flavored with herbs that made each bite a new discovery. There was fresh bread still warm from the oven, butter that had been churned that morning, and milk so cold and sweet it seemed like a gift from the gods. For someone who had been facing death by starvation just hours earlier, it was nothing short of miraculous. Matt had cleaned up for dinner, trading his work clothes for a white cotton shirt and dark trousers that made him look less like a rancher and more like the educated man Ciala was beginning to suspect he actually was. His hair was damp from washing, and he had shaved the trail dust from his face, revealing features that were strong and honest and marked by years of outdoor work. "So," he said gently, as Ciala worked her way through her second bowl of stew, "want to tell us what happened? Why your own people would do such a thing to a young woman who looks like she's never hurt a soul in her life?" His tone was carefully neutral, but Ciala could hear the anger underneath, the outrage of someone who believed in basic human decency. Between bites of bread and sips of milk, she told them her story. About being the half-blood child who never quite belonged anywhere. About the drought and the failed hunts that had turned desperation into superstition. About the tribal council's decision that she was cursed, that her death would appease the angry spirits and restore prosperity to the people. About 3 days in the Canyon of Bones, with nothing but a single gourd of water and the certainty that she would never see another sunrise. Rosa clicked her tongue sympathetically throughout the telling, occasionally reaching over to pat Ciala's hand or refill her glass. Matt listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that every word mattered, his face growing darker as the full scope of what had been done to her became clear. "Superstitious fools," he muttered when she finished, "blaming a child for weather and wildlife cycles that have been going on since before any of us were born. Takes a special kind of cowardice to sacrifice someone who can't fight back." He caught himself getting worked up and made a visible effort to calm down. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to speak ill of your people, but what they did to you was wrong, plain and simple wrong." Ciala looked down at her hands, still trying to process the fact that she was alive and safe and fed. "They are not my people anymore," she said quietly. "The death marks made that clear. Even if I wanted to return, I would be killed on sight. The spirits have marked me as dead, and the living cannot welcome back the dead." "Then you'll stay here," Matt said matter-of-factly. "At least until you figure out what you want to do next. We've got plenty of room, and Rosa's been after me for years to get more help around the house. You can earn your keep if it makes you feel better about accepting charity." Rosa nodded enthusiastically. "See, there is always work to be done. Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, mending clothes. And this house is too quiet with just an old woman and a stubborn bachelor rattling around in it. Some young company would be good for both of us." That night, Ciala lay in the softest bed she had ever experienced, in a room with real glass windows and wallpaper printed with tiny flowers, and tried to understand what had happened to her. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing to die alone in a place of bones and ancient sorrows. Now she was clean and fed and safe, surrounded by people who had shown her more kindness in one evening than her own tribe had managed in 14 years. The room Rosa had given her was on the second floor, with a view of the valley that stretched away toward the distant mountains. A washstand held a pitcher and basin decorated with blue roses. A wardrobe contained more clothes than Ciala had ever owned, all carefully cleaned and mended by Rosa's patient hands. On the bedside table sat a kerosene lamp and a small stack of books, as if education and entertainment were simply expected parts of daily life. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of the Crosswind Ranch. Cattle moved like shadows across the pastures, and she could see the warm glow of lanterns in the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were settling in for the night. It was a world of order and purpose, of people working together toward common goals. So different from the harsh struggle for survival that had defined her entire life. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Mija, are you all right?" Rosa's voice was gentle but concerned. "Yes," Ciala called back, "just looking at the stars." The door opened and Rosa entered, carrying a cup of something that smelled like warm milk and honey. "I thought you might have trouble sleeping your first night in a new place. This will help." She set the cup on the bedside table and settled into the room's single chair. "Do you want to talk? Sometimes it helps to get the thoughts out of your head before trying to sleep." Ciala returned to the bed, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to me. You don't know anything about me except that my own people wanted me dead. For all you know, they were right. Maybe I am cursed." Rosa's laugh was warm and completely without mockery. "Mija, I have lived 53 years on this earth, and I have learned to recognize good hearts and bad ones. Yours is good, even if it has been hurt. As for curses," she made a dismissive gesture, "the only curse I see is the one of being born different in a world that fears anything it doesn't understand. Matt could have left me in the canyon. Why didn't he? What does he gain by helping me?" "That boy," Rosa said, with the fond exasperation of someone who had been watching over Matt Crosswind for years, "has been alone too long. His parents died when he was barely 20, left him to run this whole operation by himself. He works from sunup to sundown, never takes a day off, never goes to town except for supplies. I keep telling him he needs to find a nice girl and settle down, but he says he's too busy. Maybe what he really needed was someone who needed him." She reached over and patted Ciala's hand. "Don't worry so much about why, Mija. Sometimes good things happen just because they're supposed to happen. Sometimes people help each other just because it's the right thing to do. You're safe here, and you're welcome here, and that's all you need to worry about tonight." After Rosa left, Ciala sipped the warm milk and honey and tried to absorb the reality of her situation. 3 days ago, she had been grinding corn, meal outside her grandmother's teepee, secure in the rhythm of tribal life despite her status as an outsider. Now she was in a world she barely understood, dependent on the kindness of strangers who had no obligation to care about her welfare. She thought about her grandmother, Ayana, probably sitting alone in the darkness of their abandoned teepee, wondering if her granddaughter had died bravely or if the canyon of bones had simply claimed another victim. Would the old woman grieve? Would anyone in the tribe even remember her name a year from now? The thought brought tears. She had been too shocked and exhausted to shed earlier, but alongside the grief was something else, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. For the first time in her life, she was in a place where being half-blood didn't mark her as cursed or unwanted. Matt and Rosa had looked at her and seen someone worth saving, someone worth feeding and clothing and sheltering. They had asked. No questions about her worthiness, demanded no proof of her value. As she finally drifted off to sleep in the soft bed with its clean sheets and warm blankets, Ciala allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to belong somewhere, to have a place where her skills were valued, where her presence was welcomed, where she could build something lasting instead of merely surviving from one day to the next. It was a dangerous dream, but for the first time since childhood, it felt almost possible. Outside her window, the night sounds of the ranch settled into their familiar rhythm. cattle lowing softly in the distance, horses moving restlessly in their corrals, the creek that ran through the property babbling its way toward the river. It was the sound of a place where life flourished, where people and animals lived in harmony with the land. And somewhere in that peaceful symphony, Ciala found the first real rest she had known in years. The rooster's crow that woke Ciala the next morning was unlike any sound she had ever associated with dawn. In the Comanche camp, mornings began, with the soft nickering of horses and the quiet murmur of women tending cooking fires. Here at the Crosswind Ranch, the day announced itself with a full orchestra of domestic sounds, chickens clucking in their coop, cattle calling to each other across the pastures, and the distant ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop. She, dressed quickly in the clothes Rosa had provided, marveling again at how different it felt to wear garments that had been made with care and attention to fit. The cotton dress was soft against her skin, and the leather shoes, though unfamiliar, protected her feet in a way her traditional moccasins never had. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the person, staring back. Gone was the half-blood Comanche girl marked for death. In her place stood someone who looked almost like she belonged in this world of organized prosperity. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee drew her downstairs to the kitchen, where she found Rosa already deep into breakfast preparations. The older woman looked up from the cast-iron skillet with a smile that seemed to chase away the last shadows of the previous day's trauma. "Buenos dias, mija. I was just thinking you might sleep until noon after everything you've been through. But Matt always says the best cure for trouble is keeping busy hands and a full stomach. Sit. The bacon is almost ready." Rosa gestured toward the big wooden table with a spatula that dripped with grease. Through the kitchen window, Ciala could see Matt already at work in the nearest corral, working with a young horse that seemed determined to test every boundary of acceptable behavior. He moved with the patient persistence of someone who understood that trust was earned through consistency rather than force, never raising his voice even when the horse tried to step on his foot or pull the lead rope from his hands. "He's been up since before sunrise," Rosa explained, following Ciala's gaze. "That's Thunder, a 3-year-old stallion we're breaking for the mayor of Presidio. Beautiful animal, but stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. Matt says he reminds him of himself at that age." She chuckled as she flipped the bacon, the sound warm and maternal. Breakfast was another revelation in the continuing education of what normal life could look like. Fresh eggs scrambled, with cream, bacon fried to perfect crispness, biscuits that were light and fluffy with honey butter melting into every bite. Coffee that was rich and strong, without the bitter edge of grounds that had been used too many times. For someone who had grown up on whatever the hunting parties brought back supplemented with gathered roots and berries, it was like eating in the Lodge of Chiefs. Matt came in halfway through the meal, hanging his hat on a peg by the door and washing his hands at the pump beside the sink. His shirt was already damp with sweat, despite the early hour, and there was a streak of dust across his cheek that spoke of close contact with the ground. "Thunder win another round?" Rosa asked, with the familiarity of someone who had witnessed this particular battle many times before. "Let's just say we're still negotiating the terms of our partnership," Matt replied diplomatically, settling into his chair with a slight wince that suggested the stallion had made some of his points rather forcefully. But he's starting to figure out that fighting uses more energy than cooperating. Should have him ready for a saddle by next week. He turned his attention to Ciala, studying her face with the careful attention of someone assessing recovery from trauma. "You look better this morning. Got some color back in your cheeks. And you don't look like you're expecting the world to end at any moment. How are you feeling?" The question was more complex than it seemed on the surface. How was she feeling? Grateful, certainly. Overwhelmed by the kindness she had been shown. guilty for accepting charity from strangers, afraid that this refuge was temporary and that she would soon find herself alone again. But underneath all of that was something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. Better, she said simply, because the full truth would have taken hours to explain. Good. Rose has got some ideas about putting you to work if you're up for it. Nothing too strenuous to start with, just helping around the house and maybe learning some new skills. We believe in earning our keep around here, but we also believe in giving folks time to find their feet. Rosa nodded enthusiastically. The garden needs weeding, and I've been meaning to reorganize the pantry for months. Plus, if you're going to stay here for any length of time, you'll need to learn how to cook for cowboys. They eat like horses and complain twice as much if the food isn't to their liking. The morning passed in a blur of new experiences and small revelations. Rosa proved to be a patient teacher, showing Ciala how to use the various tools and implements that made ranch life possible. The garden was a wonder of organization and abundance, with neat rows of vegetables thriving under careful cultivation. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, beans climbed tall stakes in perfect lines, and herbs perfumed the air with scents that promised flavor and healing. The secret, Rosa explained as they worked side by side pulling weeds, is understanding what each plant needs. Some like lots of water, some prefer to be dry, some need full sun, others do better in shade. It's like people, really. You have to pay attention and give each one what they need to thrive. Ciala found herself thinking about those words as they moved on to other tasks. In the Comanche camp, survival had been about fitting into established patterns, about not standing out or causing trouble. Here, it seemed like success was about discovering what you were good at and then being encouraged to develop those talents. The pantry reorganization project revealed the true scope of the Crosswind Ranch's prosperity. Shelves lined with preserved fruits and vegetables, barrels of flour and sugar, sides of bacon hanging from hooks in the ceiling. There was enough food stored here to feed a small army through a hard winter, and all of it was organized with the methodical care of someone who understood the value of preparation. Matt's father taught him that a well-stocked pantry is the difference between surviving hard times and thriving through them. Rosa explained as they sorted through jars of pickled vegetables. Every good year, you prepare for the bad ones. Every successful harvest, you set aside what you'll need when the crops fail. It's not hoarding, it's wisdom. As they worked, Rosa shared stories about the ranch and the people who had built it. Matt's father had been a dreamer who saw potential in land that others considered worthless. His mother had been the practical one, the one who turned dreams into reality through careful planning and tireless work. They had built the Crosswind Ranch from nothing, proving that determination and intelligence could overcome almost any obstacle. Matt was only 20 when they died, Rosa said, her voice soft with old grief. Influenza took them both within. A week of each other left that boy to figure out how to run this whole operation by himself. I thought for sure he'd sell out and head back east to civilization. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and proved he was every bit as stubborn as his parents. The afternoon brought new challenges and new discoveries. Matt returned from his work with Thunder to find Ciala helping Rosa prepare lunch for the ranch hands, her hands already showing the confidence that came from tasks that made sense. She was slicing vegetables for a massive pot of stew, her knife work precise and efficient. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her work. "Different vegetables, same principle," she replied. "My grandmother taught me that a sharp knife and patience can turn the toughest root into something tender and nourishing." It was the first time she had mentioned her grandmother without pain clouding her expression, and Matt filed that small victory away as significant progress. Recovery from trauma, he had learned from his own experience, happened in small steps rather than grand gestures. The ranch hands who came in for lunch were a diverse group that reflected the melting pot nature of frontier life. There was Jose, an older Mexican vaquero whose skill with horses was legendary throughout the territory. Tommy, a young Irish immigrant who had traded the slums of Boston for the open spaces of Texas. Samuel, a freed slave who had found in ranch work the dignity and fair wages that Reconstruction had promised but not always delivered. And Big Jim, a former mountain man whose stories of life in the wilderness could keep the bunkhouse entertained for hours. They greeted Ciala with the polite courtesy of men who had been raised to respect women, especially in the presence of their boss. But she could see the curiosity in their eyes, the questions they were too well-mannered to ask directly. Who was she? Where had she come from? What was her relationship to Matt Crosswind? "Boys," Matt said as they settled around the big table, "I'd like you to meet Ciala. She'll be helping Rosa around the house for a while. I expect you to treat her with the same respect you'd show your own sisters." His tone was casual, but there was an undertone of steel that suggested serious consequences for anyone who chose to ignore his expectations. The conversation over lunch was the education in the social dynamics of ranch life. The men talked about cattle prices and weather patterns, about horses that needed breaking and fences that needed mending. But they also talked about books they had read, places they had traveled, dreams they harbored for the future. It wasn't the rough, uneducated environment she had expected. "Education is important out here," Matt explained when she commented on this later. "A man who can't read or figure numbers is at the mercy of anyone who can. I pay my hands well, but I also expect them to better themselves. Most of these boys are saving money to buy their own land someday, and they'll need every skill they can get." After lunch, Matt took her on a tour of the ranch proper, showing her the scope of the operation he managed. The main barn was a cathedral of organized efficiency, with stalls for 30 horses and storage for enough hay and grain to last through the worst winter. The blacksmith shop contained tools and equipment that represented years of investment in quality workmanship. Corrals and pastures stretched to the horizon, each one serving a specific purpose in the complex dance of cattle ranching. My father started with nothing but a dream and $500 he'd saved from years of factory work back in Ohio, Matt said as they stood on a ridge overlooking the heart of the ranch. Said he was tired of making other men rich and wanted to build something that would last. Took him 15 years to prove he was right. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but so was the weight of responsibility. Ciala realized that Matt Crosswind was not just a rancher. He was the guardian of his family's legacy, the one responsible for preserving and building on everything his parents had sacrificed to create. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they made their way back to the house for supper preparations. Rosa had already started the evening meal, but she welcomed Ciala's help with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested genuine pleasure in having another woman to share the work. "Tell me about your grandmother," Rosa said, as they worked together preparing vegetables for a massive pot of beef stew. "The way you handle a knife tells me she was a good teacher." For the first time since her rescue, Ciala found herself able to talk about Ayana without the crushing weight of loss overwhelming her words. She described the old woman's patience and wisdom, her skill with traditional medicines, her ability to find hope even in the darkest circumstances. As she talked, she realized that her grandmother's teachings had not been lost in the Canyon of Bones. They had been transformed, adapted to new circumstances and new challenges. "She sounds like a wise woman," Rosa said when Ciala finished. "The kind who understands that love sometimes means letting go, even when it breaks your heart. I think she would be proud to see you learning new ways to use the skills she taught you." That evening's supper was a celebration of abundance and community. The big kitchen table was crowded with ranch hands and family, the conversation flowing as freely as Rosa's excellent coffee. Ciala found herself drawn into discussions about everything from the best way to break a young horse to the political situation brewing between Texas and Mexico. For someone who had spent her life on the periphery of tribal decision-making, being included in these conversations was intoxicating. After supper, as the men headed back to the bunkhouse and Rosa cleaned up the kitchen, Matt invited Ciala to join him on the front porch. The evening air was soft and warm, filled with the sounds of night-settling creatures and the distant lowing of cattle. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, more brilliant than she had ever seen them through the smoke of cook fires. "You did good today," Matt said, settling into one of the wooden chairs that lined the porch. "Rosa says you're a natural in the kitchen, and I saw how you handled yourself around the boys at lunch. Not everyone can walk into a new situation and find their place so quickly." Ciala took the chair beside him, still marveling at the simple luxury of furniture designed for comfort rather than mere function. "I'm not sure I've found my place yet. I'm still figuring out what that even means." "Fair enough, but from where I sit, it looks like you're off to a good start." Matt was quiet for a moment, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Can I ask you something? Back in your tribe, what did you want to be when you grew up? Before all this happened, what were your dreams?" The question caught her off guard. In Comanche society, a girl's future was largely predetermined. She would marry, bear children, support her husband's family, and pass on the traditional ways to the next generation. Dreams beyond that framework were not just impractical. They were potentially dangerous. "I wanted to be a healer," she said finally. "My grandmother was teaching me about plants and their uses, about setting bones and treating fever. But the medicine man said it was dangerous for someone with bad blood to handle the sacred arts. He was afraid I might pass my curse to the people. I was trying to help." Matt's jaw tightened with familiar anger at the injustice of it. "There's nothing cursed about wanting to help people heal. That's one of the noblest callings there is. If you're still interested in learning, Doc Peterson in town is always looking for someone to help him with his practice. He's getting old, and there's more sickness out here than one man can handle." The possibility hung between them like a gift too precious to believe in. To not just survive, but to build a life around the dreams that had sustained her through the darkest times. It was more than she had dared to hope for. "But I'm not trained in white medicine," she protested. "I don't know about the tools and techniques Dr. Peterson would use." "Then you learn," Matt said simply. "You're smart. You're determined, and you've already got more knowledge about healing plants than most folks ever acquire. The rest is just different methods for achieving the same goals. Doc Peterson would be lucky to have someone with your natural understanding of medicine." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, Ciala felt something she had never experienced before, the sense that her future was truly her own to shape. Not constrained by blood quantum or tribal politics, not limited by other people's fears and superstitions. For the first time in her life, she could imagine herself not just surviving, but thriving. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the peaceful spell, and they looked up to see a rider approaching fast through the darkness. As he drew closer, they could see it was one of the neighboring ranchers, Sam Weston, and his horse was lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Matt!" he called out as he reined in at the porch steps. "Thank God you're here. We've got trouble heading our way. Big trouble." Sam Weston's horse was still breathing hard as he dismounted, his face grim in the lamplight spilling from the porch. Matt was already on his feet, and Ciala could see the transformation that came over him when crisis threatened his domain. The relaxed rancher disappeared, replaced by a man who carried the weight of protecting everything his family had built. "What kind of trouble, Sam?" Matt's voice was steady, but his hand instinctively moved to rest on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Renegades," Sam said, accepting the glass of water Rosa brought from the kitchen without being asked. 20, maybe 30 of them, led by a half-breed called Santiago Vega. They hit the Morrison place 2 days ago, burned the house, ran off all the cattle. Old man Morrison and his wife barely escaped with their lives. Ciala felt ice form in her stomach. She had heard stories of Santiago Vega around Comanche fires, whispered tales of a man who belonged to no tribe and served no chief, who gathered desperate men around him like a magnet drew iron filings. He was said to be the son of a Mexican, father and Comanche mother, rejected by both peoples and turned bitter by that rejection. Which direction are they heading? Matt asked, his mind already working through defensive strategies. North along the river valley. They're moving slow, driving stolen cattle and burning everything they can't carry. At their current pace, they'll reach your northern boundary. By tomorrow afternoon... Sam wiped his forehead with a bandana that was already soaked with sweat. Matt, they're not just raiding for supplies. They're killing anyone who gets in their way, taking scalps like they're collecting trophies. Rosa crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. She had lived through enough frontier violence to know that renegade bands were far more dangerous than regular tribal war parties. Warriors fighting for their people followed codes of honor and conduct. Renegades followed only their own twisted desires for revenge against a world that had rejected them. "How many guns can you field?" Matt asked, his question directed at Sam, but his eyes already scanning the darkness beyond the porch, as if calculating fields of fire and defensive positions. "Maybe 15 men, counting boys old enough to hold a rifle." The Hendersons lost. Gave their hands last month to that silver strike up in Colorado, and the Pattersons are down to just old Pete and his grandson, since the fever took the rest of the family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Sam's voice carried the weight of a community stretched thin by the constant demands of frontier life. Matt was quiet for a long moment, running calculations in his head. The Crosswind Ranch employed 8 full-time hands, plus himself, all experienced men who could shoot straight when their lives depended on it. But 9 rifles against 30 armed renegades were odds that would make any sensible man consider retreat. "We could send word to Fort Duncan," Rosa suggested hopefully. "The cavalry might be able to reach us in time. 3 days hard ride to the fort, 3 days back if they believe the threat is real enough to act on," Matt replied, grimly. "By then, Vega's bunch will have burned out half the county and moved on to easier pickings elsewhere. No, if we're going to stop them, it has to be here and now." Sam nodded reluctantly. "That's what I figured you'd say. I've already sent riders to the other spreads, calling for every man who can hold a rifle to meet at your place by dawn. We make our stand here together, or we lose everything our families spent years building." As Sam remounted and rode off into the darkness to spread the word, Matt turned to find Ciala watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. In the lamplight, her face showed a maturity beyond her years, the look of someone who had already faced death and found the strength to survive it. "This Santiago Vega," she said quietly, "I've heard stories about him in the tribal camps. They say he's smart and cruel in equal measure, that he studies his enemies before attacking. He'll know about this ranch, about how prosperous it is, about how many men you can field." Matt studied her face carefully. "You think he's specifically targeting us?" "I think he's targeting what you represent," she replied, choosing her words with care. "Success, prosperity, the idea that people of different backgrounds can work together to build something lasting. Men like Santiago hate that kind of hope because it shows them what they could have been if they'd chosen differently." The insight was startling in its clarity, and Matt found himself reassessing his young houseguest yet again. There was wisdom in her words that came from understanding the dark side of human nature, knowledge that had probably been hard-won through her own experiences of rejection and persecution. "Then you understand why we can't run," he said. "This trench isn't just land and buildings and cattle. It's proof that the frontier doesn't have to be a place where only the strongest survive. It's a place where people can build communities, where they can work together to create something better than what they left behind." Rosa had been listening from the doorway, and now she stepped forward with the determined expression Ciala had learned meant the older woman had made up her mind about something. "Matt, you need to send the girl away, tonight, before the fighting starts." "No," Ciala said firmly, surprising them both with the steel in her voice. "I won't run again. I've spent my whole life being driven from place to place, never allowed to fight for anything because I wasn't considered worth defending. This ranch gave me shelter when I needed it most. These people treated me like family when my own blood wanted me dead. If Santiago Vega wants to destroy that, he'll have to go through me too." Matt looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened girl he had rescued from the canyon of bones, but a young woman who had found something worth protecting. "Can you shoot?" "My grandmother taught me to use a bow. I can put an arrow through a rabbit's eye at 50 paces. A rifle can't be that much different." The confidence in her voice was not boastful but matter-of-fact, the statement of someone who had learned to rely on her own skills for survival. "It's different enough," Matt said with a slight smile. "But Jose can teach you the basics in a few hours if you're determined to stay. Just remember, once the shooting starts, there's no taking it back. Men will die tomorrow, probably good men along with the bad ones. Men have been dying around." "Me my whole life," Ciala replied quietly. "The difference is, this time I get to choose which side I'm on." The rest of the night passed in a blur of preparation and grim planning. The ranch hands worked by lantern light to create defensive positions, using everything from overturned wagons to bales of hay to construct barriers that might stop bullets. Matt sent his fastest rider to the neighboring spreads with specific instructions about timing and positioning, turning the Crosswind Ranch into the center of a web of coordinated resistance. Jose took Ciala to the rifle range behind the main barn, where targets had been set up for regular practice sessions. The Winchester rifle felt strange in her hands after a lifetime of handling bows, but the principles were similar. Sight alignment, breath control, steady pressure on the trigger. By the fourth shot, she was consistently hitting the center of the target at 100 yards. "Muy buena," Jose said with approval. "The señorita has steady hands and a good eye. With practice, she could be as good as any vaquero." He handed her a cartridge belt heavy with ammunition. "Remember, in a fight, accuracy matters more than speed. Take your time. Make each shot. And count." Meanwhile, Rosa had transformed the kitchen into a field hospital, boiling water and preparing bandages with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Her movements were quick and purposeful, but Ciala could see the fear in the older woman's eyes, the knowledge that tomorrow might bring losses that no amount of preparation could prevent. "You should be proud of that boy," Rosa said, as they worked together, cutting sheets into bandage strips. "Most men his age would be thinking about saving their own skin, maybe grabbing what portable wealth they could carry and heading for safer territory. Instead, he's thinking about everyone who depends on this place for their livelihood. He's not just fighting for the ranch," Ciala observed. "He's fighting for the idea that people can create something better than what they found. That's worth dying for." Rosa looked at her sharply. "It's also worth living for, Mija. Don't go getting any heroic ideas about sacrificing yourself for the greater good. Dead martyrs don't help anybody." As dawn approached, riders began arriving from the neighboring ranches. They came alone or in small groups, grim-faced men who carried their rifles with the familiarity of long practice. Sam Weston returned with his promised 15, followed by old Pete Patterson and his teenage grandson, Billy. The Henderson brothers rode in just as the eastern sky began to lighten. their faces showing the strain of riding hard through the night. Matt gathered the assembled defenders in the main yard, using the porch steps as an impromptu platform to address the group. In the grey light of early dawn, Ciala could see that they had managed to assemble perhaps 30 men, a respectable force, but still outnumbered by Santiago's renegades. "Boys," Matt began, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "I won't lie to you about what we're facing today. Santiago Vega has a reputation for brutality that he's earned through years of terrorizing honest folks who just want to live their lives in peace. He's got more men than we do, and they're desperate enough to fight like cornered animals." "I says," murmur ran through the assembled group, but no one stepped back or made moves toward their horses. These were men who had invested everything they owned in this harsh but promising land, and they understood that sometimes investment required protection. "But we've got advantages they don't," Matt continued. "We know this country like the back of our hands. We're fighting to protect what we've built, instead of just trying to steal what others have created. And most importantly, we're fighting together as neighbors and friends, instead of as a collection of outlaws held together by nothing but greed and hate." Jose had climbed to the roof of the main house and now called down a warning. "Riders approaching from the south. Looks like a scouting party, maybe 5 or 6 men." Matt nodded grimly. "Positions, everyone. This is it." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrifying clarity that comes with mortal danger. The scouting party approached boldly, making no attempt at concealment, clearly intending to assess the ranch's defenses before the main force arrived. They were hard-looking men, dressed in a mixture of cavalry blue, Mexican leather, and Indian buckskin, their allegiance belonging to no nation or tribe, but to the violent man who led them. At 200 yards they stopped and studied the ranch buildings, taking note of the defensive preparations and counting the rifle barrels pointing in their direction. Their leader, a scarred Mexican with sergeant's stripes on his stolen cavalry jacket, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted a message in accented English. "Santiago Vega gives you one chance to surrender. Send out all your cattle, all your horses, and all your women, and maybe some of you live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and we burn everything and everyone to ash and bone." Matt stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "You tell Santiago Vega that Matt Crosswind says he can go straight to hell, and he can take his murderous pack of cowards with him. This ranch has stood against drought, flood, blizzards, and Comanche war parties, and it'll damn sure stand against a collection of mad dogs who are too lazy to earn an honest living." The leader's scarred face split into an ugly grin. "Big talk from a dead man. We'll be back within the hour with 30 guns and torches, enough to light up the whole county. You think about that while you're praying to whatever god you figure might still be listening." As the scouting party wheeled and galloped back toward the south, Matt felt a hand touch his shoulder. He turned to find Ciala beside him, her face calm despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. "In my grandmother's stories," she said quietly, "the greatest battles were always fought by people who had something worth dying for. Today, we get to find out if those stories were true." The sound of many horses moving at speed carried across the morning air, growing steadily louder as Santiago's main force approached the Crosswind Ranch. Matt checked his rifle one final time and looked around at the men who had chosen to make their stand with him. Neighbors, friends, and employees who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "Remember," he called out, as the thunder of hoofbeats grew closer, "we're not just defending buildings and livestock. We're defending the idea that decent people can build something good in this hard country. Don't let them take that away from us." The battle for the Crosswind Ranch was about to begin, and with it, the test of whether civilization could take root in ground watered by so much blood and sacrifice. They came like a plague of locusts across the morning landscape, 30 riders spread in a loose line that stretched from one end of the valley to the other. Santiago Vega rode at their center on a magnificent black stallion, his presence unmistakable even at a distance. He wore a mixture of stolen military insignia and Indian war paint, a deliberate statement that he belonged to no nation and followed no law except his own twisted sense of justice. Ciala crouched behind the overturned wagon that formed part of the main defensive line, her borrowed Winchester rifle heavy in her hands. From her position, she could see the entire sweep of Santiago's force, and what she saw made her blood run cold. These were not desperate men driven to banditry by hunger or circumstance. They were predators who had chosen violence as their path. Through the world. "Steady, boys," Matt called from his position near the porch. "Let them come into range before anyone opens fire. We can't afford to waste ammunition on long shots that might not hit anything important." His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had thought through every aspect of what was about to happen. The renegades approached with the confidence of wolves, circling a wounded deer, taking their time to study the defenses and look for weaknesses. Santiago himself rode closer than the others, close enough that Ciala could see the ritual scars on his face and the necklace of scalps that hung across his chest like some obscene decoration. "Matthew Crosswind!" Santiago's voice carried easily across the distance, accented with the musical cadence of educated Spanish. "I know who you are, gringo. I know about your fine ranch, your fat cattle, your prosperous life built on land stolen from my mother's people. Today, you pay the price for your ancestors' greed." Matt stepped out from behind cover, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "Your quarrel is with dead men, Santiago. The Comanche sold this land fair and square 20 years ago. I've never taken anything that wasn't freely given or honestly purchased." Santiago's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Honest? You call it honest when the blue-coat soldiers force treaties at gunpoint? You call it honest when diseased blankets and poisoned whiskey reduce proud nations to begging for scraps? From Washington bureaucrats, there is no honest transaction between the conquered and their conquerors. Then what's this really about?" Matt demanded, understanding that Santiago was playing for time while his men completed their encirclement. "You've got 30 guns against our few. You could have hit us at dawn and taken what you wanted without all this speechifying. This is about making an example," Santiago replied, his scarred face twisted with years of accumulated hatred. "When word spreads that Santiago Vega burned the mighty Crosswind Ranch to ash, every other gringo settler will think twice before they plant their flag on Indian soil. Fear is a weapon sharper than any knife." From her concealed position, Ciala could see what Matt couldn't. 3 of Santiago's men had dismounted and were working their way through the brush along the creek bed, trying to flank the main defensive line. Their movement was careful and coordinated, the work of experienced fighters who understood how to use terrain to their advantage. She took careful aim at the leading flanker, a thin man with a cavalry saber strapped to his back. The distance was perhaps 80 yards, well within her capability with the rifle Jose had taught her to use. But taking the shot would reveal her position and draw return fire from the main group. The decision was taken out of her hands when young Billy Patterson, positioned near the creek, spotted the flanking movement and fired without warning. His shot went wide, but it broke the tense standoff like a stone through glass. Santiago raised his arm and brought it down in a savage chopping motion, and suddenly the morning air was filled with the thunder of hoofbeats and the wild yells of men charging into battle. Ciala squeezed her trigger and saw the flanking. Scout tumbled from his crouch, her bullet taking him in the chest. She worked the rifle's lever action and immediately shifted her aim to the next man in the creek bed, firing again before he could bring his own weapon to bear. The familiar rhythm of loading and firing, the steady pressure of the rifle butt against her shoulder felt natural despite her lack of experience with firearms. The main charge hit the defensive line like a hammer blow. Santiago's men came, hard and fast, firing from horseback with the wild accuracy of riders who had learned to shoot while controlling a mount with their knees. Bullets splintered wood and kicked up geysers of dirt, but the improvised fortifications held against the initial assault. Matt's Winchester spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately fired. He dropped Santiago's lieutenant, a huge man with braided hair who was trying to leap his horse over the wagon barricade. The horse crashed into the wooden barrier, and both animal and rider went down in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Jose, positioned on the roof of the main house, had the advantage of height and a clear field of fire. His rifle cracked steadily as he picked targets among the circling riders, each shot calculated to maximum effect. Two of Santiago's men fell to his marksmanship before return fire forced him to seek better cover behind the stone chimney. But numbers began to tell as the battle continued. Santiago's men were experienced fighters who knew how to coordinate their attacks and maintain pressure on multiple points simultaneously. They had split into 3 groups, one continuing the frontal assault, one working around the eastern flank, and one moving to attack the barn and outbuildings where some of the defenders had taken position. "They're trying to surround us," Sam Weston called from his position near the chicken coop. "If they get behind us, we'll be caught in a crossfire with nowhere to run." Matt could see the tactical situation developing and knew they had to act quickly or be overwhelmed by superior numbers and positioning. "Tommy, take 4 men and hold the eastern approach. Jose, can you get to the barn loft and give those boys some covering fire?" The Irish immigrant and the Mexican vaquero moved immediately, understanding that coordination would be the key to survival. Tommy's group sprinted across open ground under covering fire from the main line, bullets whining around them like angry hornets. 2 made it safely to the defensive position behind the feed trough. Tommy himself stumbled and went down, clutching his shoulder but still firing his rifle one-handed. Ciala saw Santiago himself break away from the main group, leading 5 men in a charge directly at the porch where Matt was positioned. The renegade leader had identified the defenders' command post and was trying to decapitate their resistance with one decisive stroke. His black stallion leaped obstacles like it had wings, and his rifle blazed with deadly accuracy. Without conscious thought, Ciala rose from behind her cover and sprinted toward the porch, her rifle firing as she ran. One of Santiago's escort riders pitched from his saddle, and another reined his horse away as her bullets came uncomfortably close. She reached the porch steps just as Santiago's charge arrived, throwing herself between Matt and the renegade leader's aimed rifle. Santiago's shot took her in the left side, spinning her around and dropping her to the wooden planks. But her movement had spoiled his aim at Matt, and now the rancher's return fire forced the renegade leader to wheel his horse away before he could deliver a finishing blow. "Ciala!" Rosa's voice cut through the battle noise as the older woman ran from the house, medical supplies in her hands and complete disregard for the bullets still flying around the yard. She reached the fallen girl and immediately began assessing the wound, her experienced fingers probing for damage while she used her own body to shield her patient from further harm. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of Ciala's side without hitting vital organs, but she was losing blood rapidly and shock was setting in from the trauma and pain. Rosa worked with practiced efficiency, pressing bandages against the entry and exit wounds while murmuring reassurances in Spanish. "I'm fine," Ciala gasped, trying to sit up despite the fire in her side. "The rifle, where's my rifle?" "They're still coming." "You're not fine, Misha, and you're not fighting anymore," Rosa said firmly, using her considerable bulk to keep the wounded girl flat on her back. "You've done enough heroic nonsense for one day, but Santiago's assault was far from over. Having failed to break the main defensive line with his initial charge, he had pulled his men back to a safe distance and was now directing a more methodical attack. Groups of riders would charge one section of the defenses while others provided covering fire, then withdraw before the defenders could concentrate their response. The pattern continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Charge and withdraw. Probe for weaknesses, keep the defenders pinned down, and gradually wear them down through superior numbers. Matt could see his ammunition running low, could see exhaustion beginning to tell on men who had been fighting desperately, for their lives. It was old Pete Patterson who spotted the smoke rising from the direction of the barn. "Fire!" he shouted, pointing toward the growing column of black smoke. "They've set the hayloft burning." The fire was Santiago's masterstroke, a way to force the defenders out of their prepared positions. The barn contained not only the winter's hay supply, but also the grain stores that would feed the horses and cattle through the lean months. If it burned completely, the ranch would face starvation, even if they survived the immediate battle. "We have to save it," Matt said, understanding the implications immediately. "Sam, take 10 men and get to that fire before it spreads to the other buildings. The rest of us will try to keep Santiago's boys busy." But as soon as the firefighting party broke cover, Santiago's hidden riflemen opened up from positions among the oak trees along the creek. It was a carefully planned trap. Set the fire to force movement, then massacre the defenders when they tried to respond to the threat. Sam Weston made it perhaps 20 yards before a bullet took him in the chest, dropping him to his knees in the dusty yard. 3 more of the firefighters fell before they could reach any kind of cover, caught in the open by disciplined rifle fire from concealed positions. "It's no good," Henderson called from behind the overturned wagon. "They've got us pinned. They're down solid. We can't move without getting shot to pieces." Santiago appeared again at the edge of rifle range, his scarred face showing savage satisfaction at the trap he had sprung. "Crosswind. You see how it is? Your barn burns while your friends die in the dirt. Surrender now and I kill only the men. Fight on and everyone dies, including the women." Matt looked around at his remaining defenders. Perhaps 15 men still able to fight, most of them wounded, all of them running low on ammunition. The barn was blazing now, flames reaching toward the other buildings, and more of Santiago's men were moving to outflank their positions. The tactical situation was hopeless, but surrender meant watching everything his family had built reduced to ash and bone. It meant abandoning the community of neighbors who had trusted him enough to risk their lives defending his ranch. It meant giving Santiago the victory that would encourage other renegade bands to prey on honest settlers throughout the territory. "Go to hell, Santiago," Matt called back, his rifle swinging to cover the renegade leader. "This ranch stands as long as one man with a gun draws breath to defend it." Santiago's answering laugh was cut short by the distant sound of a bugle call echoing across the valley. All eyes turned toward the southern ridge, where a line of blue uniforms had appeared against the morning sky. The United States cavalry had arrived, moving at the gallop with sabers gleaming and guidons streaming. "In the wind! Madre de Dios!" Jose breathed from his position on the roof. "It's Captain Morrison from Fort Duncan. Looks like he brought the whole troop." The effect on Santiago's men was immediate and devastating. Renegades who had been confident of victory suddenly found themselves caught between the defenders. They had been besieging and a disciplined cavalry force advancing with military precision. Some tried to fight, wheeling their horses to face this new threat. Others simply broke and ran, scattering like leaves before a hurricane. Santiago himself remained defiant to the end, spurring his black stallion toward the approaching cavalry in a final desperate charge. His rifle cracked once, twice before a dozen carbines spoke almost simultaneously. Horse and rider went down together, rolling in the dust until they lay still. The battle for the Crosswind Ranch was over, but the cost had been terrible. 6. Good men lay dead in the yard, and twice that many carried wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. The barn was a total loss, along with months of stored feed and supplies. Buildings would have to be rebuilt, animals replaced, trust restored in a community that had seen too much violence. As Captain Morrison's troopers rounded up the surviving renegades and tended to the wounded, Matt knelt beside Ciala where Rosa was still working to stop the bleeding from her gunshot wound. The girl's face was pale but determined, her eyes still alert despite the trauma her body had endured. "You saved my life," Matt said quietly, taking her hand in both of his. "When Santiago had me dead to rights, you threw yourself between us without thinking. Why would you do such a thing?" Ciala managed a weak smile. "Because this is my home now, and these are my people. I wasn't about to let some bitter old man destroy that just because he never learned the difference between justice and revenge." As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, painting the smoke-stained ranch buildings in golden light, Matt Crosswind looked around at what remained of his life's work and realized that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in what you managed to keep, but in who chose to stand beside you when everything was on the line. 3 months after the battle, the Crosswind Ranch looked nothing like the war-torn landscape Santiago Vega had left behind. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, built with help from every surviving neighbor who had stood with Matt during those desperate hours. Its timber frame was stronger than before, its design improved by hard-won experience and the collective wisdom of men who understood that what they built together would last longer than anything constructed in isolation. Ciala stood in the doorway of the main house, her left arm still stiff from the gunshot wound that had nearly cost her life. The scar would always be there, a permanent reminder of the day she had chosen to fight for something larger than her own survival. But the pain was gone now, replaced by the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had helped preserve something worth preserving. "The Patterson boy is here to see you," Rosa called from the kitchen, where she was preparing lunch for the crew of carpenters still working on the final details of the barn reconstruction. Her voice carried the warm approval she reserved for young men who showed proper respect when courting. Billy Patterson had been one of the wounded in the battle, taking a bullet through his leg that had kept him bedridden for weeks. But he had healed well, and his frequent visits to check on Ciala's recovery had gradually evolved into something that looked suspiciously like formal courtship. At 19, he was earnest and hard-working, with dreams of expanding his grandfather's small spread into something that could support a family. "Miss Ciala," Billy said formally, removing his hat as she stepped onto the porch. "I was wondering if you might like to ride out to the east pasture with me this afternoon. Matt says the wildflowers are particularly fine this year, and I thought you might enjoy seeing them." The invitation was innocent enough, but they both understood the deeper significance. In frontier society, a young man asking a young woman to ride out alone was tantamount to declaring serious intentions. It was a step toward the kind of formal engagement that led to marriage and children and the building of new families on old foundations. "That sounds lovely, Billy," Ciala replied, though something in her voice suggested she had reservations she wasn't ready to voice. "Let me get my riding coat and tell Rosa where we're going." As they rode out together toward the blooming meadows, Ciala found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken since that terrible day in the Canyon of Bones. She had gone from being marked for death by her own people to being courted by a respectable young rancher who saw her as a suitable wife and mother for his future children. It was everything she should have wanted: security, acceptance, a place in the community. But something felt incomplete, like a melody missing its final notes. Billy was kind and hard-working and genuinely cared for her welfare, but their conversations, never moved beyond the practical concerns of frontier life. He saw her as someone to be protected and provided for, not as a partner whose opinions and insights might contribute to their shared future. "I've been thinking," Billy said as they dismounted beside a creek bordered with Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets, "about expanding the Patterson place. Grandfather's getting too old to handle all the work, and I figure with the right improvements, we could double our herd within 5 years. Course, I'd need a wife to help manage the domestic side of things." It was as close to a formal proposal as frontier courtesy allowed without actually speaking the words outright. Billy was offering her everything that society said a young woman should want: a home, security, children, respectability. The fact that he was also offering it without any real understanding of who she was or what she might want from life was apparently irrelevant. "Billy," Ciala said gently, settling on a fallen log beside the creek, "you're a good man, and any woman would be fortunate to share your life. But I'm not sure I'm the right woman for what you're offering." His face showed confusion rather than hurt, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would hesitate to accept such a generous offer. "Is it because of what happened to you before? Because of your mixed blood? I want you to know that doesn't matter to me. I judge people by their character, not their ancestry. I know you do, and I'm grateful for that, but it's not about my past or my bloodline. It's about what I want to do with my future." She picked up a smooth stone from the creek bank, turning it over in her fingers while she searched for the right words. "Do you remember what I told you about wanting to be a healer? About learning from my grandmother how to treat sickness and injury?" "Of course, but that was just girlish dreams," Billy said, with the patronizing kindness of someone who thought he understood women's limitations. "Once you have children of your own to care for, you won't have time for such notions. A ranch wife has plenty to keep her busy without taking on work that's better left to trained doctors." The dismissal stung more than Ciala had expected. In the months since the battle, she had been corresponding with Dr. Peterson in town, learning about medical techniques that complemented her traditional knowledge of healing plants. The old doctor had been eager to share his expertise with someone who showed genuine interest and natural aptitude. The possibility of combining Indian wisdom with white medicine had excited them both. "What if that work isn't just a notion?" she asked quietly. "What if it's something I'm genuinely called to do? What if I could save lives and ease suffering in ways that would make a real difference in this community?" Billy's expression showed the kind of patient tolerance adults reserved for children who insisted on believing in fairy tales. "Ciala, you're a sweet girl with a good heart, but doctoring is man's work. It takes years of formal education and training that women just aren't suited for. Better to focus on the things you can actually accomplish." The conversation continued for another hour, but Ciala knew it was already over. Billy wanted a wife who would fit into his preconceived notions of what married life should look like. He wasn't interested in a partner who might challenge those assumptions or pursue goals that didn't directly serve his vision of their shared future. When they returned to the ranch, Ciala found Matt waiting on the porch with a letter in his hands and an expression of barely contained excitement on his face. "Ciala, perfect timing. I just got word from Dr. Peterson in town. He's been accepted into a new program at the medical college in San Antonio, and he wants to recommend you as his replacement for basic medical care in the county." The letter outlined an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. Dr. Peterson had been impressed enough with Ciala's knowledge and dedication to recommend her for a position that would combine traditional healing methods with basic modern medical training. She would spend 6 months studying with established doctors, then return to serve the rural communities that desperately needed medical care. "It would mean leaving the ranch," Matt continued, his voice carefully neutral. "At least for the training period, and even after that you'd be traveling constantly, going wherever the medical emergencies take you. It's not the kind of settled life most young women want. Ciala looked at the letter in her trembling hands, seeing not just words on paper, but the future she had dreamed of since childhood. The chance to heal instead of just survive, to use. Her gifts in service of something larger than her own needs, the opportunity to prove that the mixed-blood girl, once marked for death, could become someone whose life made a meaningful difference. "What do you think I should do?" she asked, though she already knew the answer in her heart. Matt was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the deeper currents of human motivation. "I think you should do what your grandmother would have wanted you to do. Follow the path that lets you become who you were meant to be, not who other people think you should be." That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ciala sat with Rosa on the porch steps and shared her decision. The older woman listened without interruption, her weathered hands busy with the mending that never seemed to end on a working ranch. "So you're going to leave us?" Rosa said finally, her voice carrying sadness but not surprise. "I figured this day would come eventually. You've got too much fire in you to be satisfied with just keeping house and raising babies, no matter how good a life that might be." "I'm not leaving forever," Ciala protested. "Dr. Peterson says I'll be assigned to serve this area after my training. I'll still be part of this community, just in a different way. See, but you'll never be the same girl who needed rescuing from that terrible canyon. You'll be Dr. Ciala, the woman who saves lives and brings healing to places where hope has died. That's as it should be, Misha. But forgive an old woman for mourning the daughter I'm about to lose." The farewell dinner 3 days later brought together everyone who had been touched by Ciala's journey from condemned girl to community healer. The surviving defenders of the ranch were there, along with their families and the neighbors who had helped rebuild what Santiago's hatred had tried to destroy. Even Billy Patterson came, though his manner was stiff with the disappointment of rejected courtship. Matt stood to address the gathering, his glass of Rosa's homemade wine raised in salute. "Friends, we're here tonight to honor someone who has shown us all what courage really looks like. Ciala came to us marked for death, rejected by her own people, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the strength in her heart. She's leaving us as a healer who will carry hope to places that have forgotten what it looks like." The toast that followed was heartfelt and genuine, the recognition of a community that understood they were witnessing something special. As the evening wound down and guests began making their way home, Ciala found herself alone with Matt on the porch, where they had first talked about dreams and possibilities. "I want you to know," Matt said quietly, "that there will always be a place for you here, not just a job or a room, but a home with people who love you and believe in what you're doing. When the road gets hard and the work gets lonely, remember that." "I will," she promised, meaning every word. "And I want you to know that everything I become, I owe to the day you chose to see someone worth saving instead of just another lost soul in the canyon of bones. You gave me back my life, Matt. Now I'm going to spend it making sure that gift wasn't wasted." The stagecoach to San Antonio arrived at dawn, its driver impatient to make up time on the long journey ahead. Ciala's belongings fit into a single trunk. The clothes Rosa had sewn for her, the medical books Dr. Peterson had given her to study, and her grandmother's medicine pouch, still carrying the sage and turquoise and lock of hair that connected her to her origins. As the coach pulled away from the Crosswind Ranch, Ciala looked back at the people who had saved her life and taught her what family really meant. Matt stood tall and proud, his hand raised in farewell. Rosa dabbed at her eyes with her apron, making no effort to hide her tears. The ranch hands clustered around the porch, men who had learned to respect her courage and value her contributions. But She wasn't just leaving, she was carrying their influence forward into a world that desperately needed what they had taught her about the power of choosing to see potential instead of problems. The mixed-blood girl who had once been doomed in the Canyon of Bones was about to become the doctor who would bring healing to places where hope seemed as scarce as water in the desert. Years later, when Dr. Ciala Crosswind rode into remote settlements carrying her medical bag and the hard-won wisdom of someone who had been saved by kindness, children would gather around her horse to hear stories of the lonely rancher who chose compassion over indifference and the power of believing that everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't just surviving your own darkness, but carrying the light forward to illuminate the shadows, where others wait for rescue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.